Okay, so just to pick up on that last point again, I was running up to the 10-minute limit. So the impact of campaigns kind of had to cut it close earlier. Just to explain it a little bit more, campaigns have a relatively little impact in terms of actually changing people's opinion. Somebody who in January of 2008 felt like they were going to vote for the Republican candidate, whoever it was, very unlikely that they ended up voting for Barack Obama. Somebody who in January of 2008 felt like they were going to vote for the Democratic candidate, whoever it was, very unlikely that they ended up voting for John McCain. Now, they may have not voted at all, and that's a lot of where campaigns come in. They try to energize those people. They try to reinforce their beliefs about why it's an important election, about why this candidate is better than the other candidate, and so on. But they convert very few people. Very few people ever have their minds changed by campaigns. Usually, they interpret what happens in a campaign to basically harmonize with what they already believe. So if they're a Republican, they tend to interpret the campaign as showing that the Republican candidate's better. If they're a Democrat, they tend to interpret the campaign as showing that the Democrat is better. Now, that being said, in a close election, which might be decided by only 1 or 2 percentage points of the total population or of the total voting population, those that 2% of the population that may have their minds changed or that may be undecided and therefore sort of up for grabs, that can be very important, obviously, because 2% might end up deciding the election. So, in that way, campaigns can still be very important, but they're not important in the sense that everybody goes into a campaign with a totally open mind, and campaigns convert people, or they change people's minds, or they totally revolutionize the way that things go. People tend to just ignore campaigns, or they just tend to, again, interpret what they hear as reinforcing what they already believe. So, it's rare that campaigns convert people, although, again, the relatively small number of undecideds, that can be very important. And it can also be important, again, in energizing people, making sure that they do go out and vote, getting them to give money, and so on, and all of that. And so, of course, the other factor there is, as we discussed when we talked about Congress and the incumbent advantage, incumbents already have an advantage because they have name recognition and they have perceived experience. Okay, so given all of that, what do elections actually mean? There's the mandate theory of elections. That's what politicians like. They like to believe that when they're elected, the people have elected them to carry out the policies that they've argued for. So when Barack Obama was elected, he said, "I have a mandate from the American people to implement health care reform." This was debated throughout the election. Excuse me. People elected me. They elected me to carry out these policies. I have a mandate. In other words, the people have spoken and they've said, this is what we want. This is popular with politicians. They like to think that they've been elected to carry out these policies. Political scientists are much more skeptical. They say it's really not so much that a lot of people knew a lot about the different healthcare proposals of Barack Obama and John McCain. It's not that they really knew what the differences were and voted based on those differences. It's more that, party identification plays a role. It's not as strong as it used to be, but it's still somewhat strong. And certainly, it's very strong for some people. And candidate evaluations. You can, of course, sort of be cynical about this and say this is based on media image. This is based on a politician seeming young or energetic, or other silly or superficial ideas, not based on policies. But some political scientists say there are actual meaningful evaluations that people make of candidates, whether they actually seem to be competent or not. There's some somewhat meaningful judgments that people make of candidates based on what they see of them in the media. So candidate evaluations tend to be more important. So again, in 2008, it wasn't so much that people thought Barack Obama. I've spent a lot of time looking at the different healthcare proposals of Barack Obama and of John McCain. I think Obama's are better. I'm going to vote for him so that he'll implement these policies. It was more that they made evaluations of the two candidates, and they thought Barack Obama will make a better president than John McCain, and it was based on this sort of judgment. Okay. And so then moving over to the parties and interest groups slide, the main thing to talk about here, also in connection with, or the chapter and the set of slides about that, the main thing to talk about here, which is related to elections, is the idea of a party era. This is something that has happened in history. It's been clear that at different periods in history there's an era or an historical period in which one party is much more successful with the majority of voters. The majority of voters identify more with one party than with the other party, and they consistently elect their candidates both to Congress and to the presidency. Okay? So it's when one party basically dominates in politics in both the Congress and the presidency in terms of elections at the national level. Okay? Critical elections, that's when these things are changed, when coalitions break up and new coalitions form, and oftentimes it takes a few more election cycles to actually see what's going on. So, for instance, 1968, Richard Nixon won, the Republicans won, and this was basically the end of there was from roughly 1932 to 1968 was a Democratic Party era. There were Democratic presidents for all but 8 years when Dwight Eisenhower, who was a very moderate and an extremely popular former general, won. Other than that, the Democrats always won in the presidential elections, and they controlled the Congress for most of the time. They won most of the congressional elections. 1968, Nixon won the presidency, and although the Democrats maintained control of Congress, this was very important because this was the end of this coalition that had existed during this Democratic Party era. The Democrats were so successful because they had a coalition combining the South, which was still Democratic after the Civil War, because Lincoln and the radical Republicans, the South voted for the Democrats after the Civil War, and the Democratic Party stayed so strong in the South for all those years because of that. So in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, this coalition, this Democratic coalition, which was so powerful, it was based on the South and unions and industrial centers in the North. That was the coalition that was so strong. In 1968, that started to break up as a result of civil rights. The Democrats were the ones who were the ones who really championed civil rights. Lyndon Johnson was the Democratic president who signed the Civil Rights Act into law, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 into law. And so this was the end of that coalition as the South started to break away from the Democratic Party. At first there were Dixiecrats. Over time, the South became solidly Republican, which of course is what it is now. So that's an example of a critical election. It was important because the coalition of different groups, different regions, different groups in society, different political actors and political groups and so on, that coalition broke up and a new one formed, which was based on a new political reality. Okay, now party eras, you talk about party realignment, but to some extent over the last 40 years, as the final slide talks about, for only 10 of the 40 years between 1969 and 2008, so 40 years, only 10 of those years did the same party control Congress and the presidency. For the most part, you had divided government. And of course, now with the 2010 elections, you have almost basically divided government again. The Republicans control the House, the Democrats barely control the Senate, and of course the president is a Democrat. So after 2 years of the Democrats having control of the House or of the Congress and of the presidency, it's gone back to basically again divided government. So some people say what we're in now is not a party era for one party or the other, because the Democrats controlled Congress for a lot of these past 40 years, but the Republicans controlled the presidency for most of that time. And when the Democrats did have a president, Bill Clinton, from 1992 to 2000, the Republicans controlled Congress they were elected in 1994, from 1995 to 2000. So people say now what we're in really is more of an era of party de-alignment, where voters don't identify very strongly with either party, and when they vote at the national level, what they want is more divided government. So if the president is a Republican, they want Democrats in Congress and vice versa. And again, whether or not that's what's going to happen long term here, that's what's happened now with the most recent elections in 2010. Again, you have not quite full divided government, something pretty close to divided government. So again, the idea of party de-alignment, where people are moving away from both parties and wanting neither party to have too much power, and therefore going for divided government. Rather than a traditional sort of party era in which one party does extremely well in both presidential and congressional elections.